All right, dear friends. When we speak about terrorist threat in Europe, one could very easily say that the situation has changed very dramatically during a couple of last years. Attacks in Paris, Marseille, Manchester, London, Brussels, Berlin, Stockholm. All these individual actions, where unfortunately we surely will see also follow-up, has made the situation so that for European citizens, terrorism and security in general has become a major concern, actually number one concern. It's true that in Europe, in 70s, well, this is not totally new phenomenon. Terrorism we have had that before. In 70s and 80s, we remember various attacks by various extremist groups. We remember Munich, we remember Rome airport attack, and in Bologna, railway station, 85 people died. Not to speak about IRI and all the actions of ETA. But the fact is, in various countries for 3 and more decades, there has been peace concerning this subject. But now the situation has changed. Also, the tactics and the dynamics of terrorism has changed in Europe. And but nevertheless, the result is that these 3 decades of calmness have made so that in most of the public institutes, including police, security service, the large-scale terrorism has not been counted in. Also, managing of public places, airports, railway stations, and etc. So it has been that, especially during last years, there has been sudden increase on demand of Israeli expertise on this matter, on this subject. That has to do with the fact that Israel has had, for decades, have had this challenge of terrorism to the very serious extent, and to the extent that Israeli state and society has been forced to create very effective tactics and countermeasures to tackle the challenge. And in fact, that is the purpose of our debate today, to kind of tap to that knowledge pool. And what we have today is excellent, outstanding opportunity to discuss about the report of the high-level military group, which is basically consists of military leaders of NATO and other democratic countries' military leaders, which fighting terror effectively, an assessment of Israel's experience on the home front. And you will still have some free copies there in the site. So what we will discuss, that what have been the Israeli strategies, what has it meant for the institutions, and more effectively, or more importantly, how it has been implemented. What is very clear, and at least impressive for me when I was reading the report, is the fact that indeed it seems that it's not really about just concentrating all the countermeasures managed by one institute, but it demands that the whole action activities have been counted in various levels of the societies, inside the different institutes, inside the different actors, but after that you have to connect that all with one cohesive strategy. And that will be the subject of our debate today. We have outstanding panel here, and we have a panel debate moderated by Roland Freudenstau, our policy director, who will also introduce the panelists. But before that, I would have like to give the floor to Rafael Parrahi, who will give a keynote on this matter. And
thank you. I'm going to be very brief. Begin by saying that I'm standing in for Rafael, who unfortunately couldn't be here on account of an illness in his family. I'm the project director of the high-level military group. The report that we are going to present today is a report of a subgroup of that called the High-Level Homefront Group, and Colonel Kemp will perhaps in his remarks elaborate a little bit on some of the police and other security leaders that were in that group. I won't take up too much of your time. I just wanted to make one point in advance of, because I know you've all come here to actually hear about the content. The idea behind the project is very simple. It's underwritten by something called the Friends of Israel Initiative, which is a group of former prime ministers led by José María Aznar, who of course is a member of your political family too. And the idea there is that we are concerned in some way about the state of the debate about Israel, to the extent that some of the political challenges around it had begun to obscure some of the values of the Israeli experience. And so the project sought to take an independent group of top-level practitioners who could take a view on what they thought about the practices and how they were relevant. And you've got three of these relevant people here on the panel today, and I've known Roland for a long time and trust him to give us an engaging panel and draw that out. And it just remains for me to thank both Tommy and Roland and the Wilfred Martin Center for partnering on this event, and to thank the panel for making it, and all of you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Davis. And welcome to the home front. I'd like to introduce our three guest speakers here, initial guest speakers, because we also want debate, questions and answers and opinions from you, the audience. But first of all, we're going to have a three-step introduction into the topic of lessons from Israel's experience on the home front. And to my left here is Lord Harris of Haringey, counterterrorism advisor to the Mayor of London and the former chair of the Metropolitan Police. Here to my right, we have Colonel Richard Kemp, who is the former counter-terror advisor to the Cobra Committee. You may remember in recent days after terror attacks, Prime Minister May convened that committee, and it was mentioned on international media. So Colonel Kemp is was with the Cobra Committee. And last but not least, we have Nitzan Nuriel, who is the former director of the Counterterrorism Bureau of the Israeli National Security Council. So I'd like to take this in a three-step approach, and I would like to ask Nitzan Nuriel first to talk about the Israeli experience, and maybe already hinting towards the particularly valuable lessons to be learned from the Israeli experience. Then we'll continue with Colonel Kemp on the actual strategic, the transfer of these lessons to the European, the application to the British and European situation. And then at the end, Lord Harris will give us an overview of, well, what's ahead and what lies ahead of us in terms of performing better in securing the home front. So, without further ado, Nitzan, would you like to kick off?
Yes, thank you very much.
Oh, you can do it from there.
I prefer to stand.
Okay.
If it's good for the camera, I prefer to stand. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the organizer. Thanks for those who make the effort, came to Israel in order to study our lessons learned. I believe that they wrote a very good report, and I warmly recommend those who want to understand what's going in Israel to read that report and to see what they can adapt from that report. Before jumping into the main issues, I need to say three very important things. First and foremost, I warmly recommend all of us to split between politics and practice. I'm saying that you probably, or you may have many opinions about what's going in the state of Israel. I recommend us to put it out of the room and be focused on the way we are dealing with terrorism, because this is the issue. I will happy to answer your questions if you have any, but and I'm always provide the example of the Israeli-India relationship. We have a very good relationship with India, but they never vote for us in the UN. And I believe that they will never vote for us, just to show you that we can split between politics and be able to study and adapt what we can adapt from friends and allies. The second thing I need to say is that you cannot take the Israeli lessons and learn as they are. you need to put at least 3 filters. Before taking our lessons learned, you need to first have the culture filter. For us, the Israelis, open our bags or open our bagage. It's a very nature action. When somebody asks to see what do we have in our bags, we are doing it almost like a second nature, because we are doing it for many, many years. So you need to see what are the culture gaps between the Israeli society based on what we have and the European or other states' cultures' behavior. Secondly, we need to say something about technology. Later on, I'll speak much deeply about it, but if you do not use the same technology we are using, you cannot take our lessons learned. And I'm not a salesman. I'm not trying to sell you anything. All I'm saying is that you cannot adapt lessons learned from technology that not exist in your system. So you need to ask yourself what type of technology you need, what are the gaps you need to bridge, and what type of technology can provide it. And last but not least, we need to ask ourselves everything that related into the legal aspects. The Israeli law, it's probably not the same law in Europe. We need to adjust, you need to adjust. And only after using those 3 filters, we can start asking ourselves what type of lessons we can adapt into the European systems. Back to the report. I have 4 main issues that I would like you to take from that report, and if you can deliver it up to the decision makers, that will be if you ask me, the important things of that report. Above all, I believe that there is a huge lack of exercising the systems in Europe, from the personal level up to the decision makers. And I'll give you 2 small recommendations, something that we are doing in Israel. Every month, we are conducting TTX, tactical table exercise, with the decision makers, and provide scenarios that push them to take decisions. So when something really happened, they will have the feeling that they already dealt with those kind of problems. And I'm not looking of tactical issues. I'm speaking about questions like, under what conditions we will decide to shut down the schools tomorrow morning if something happened? Who can take decisions like that? What are the implications of decisions like that, shutting down the schools or the train system or even the airports? I believe that we need to draw scenarios that will push the leaders to think of the options they have and what are the outcome of those decisions. And having said that, we also need to practice the tactical level. And again, I'm sure that all of you face those young people sitting behind the screen, watching 24 screens of cameras that are spread all over the streets. It's a very effective tool, let's say, but nobody really practiced them. Nobody really challenged them by having a suspicious car parking in a place which is not supposed to. Nobody really challenged them by having someone suspicious walking around with heavy backpack on his back. So we invest a lot of money having cameras. We pay a lot of money, not a lot, we pay money to those who are sitting observing those screens, but actually they do not really support the daily life security. So we need to practice both the personals, the tactical level, as well as the decision makers, and this is number 1. Number 2, we'll go into technology. And again, I'm not a salesman. I'm not going to sell you anything. All I'm going to say is that before buying technology, ask the questions, what are the operational gaps? Technology by itself cannot solve problems. Technology by itself, it's a nice tool, costs a lot of money, give you a very good reputation that you did something, but actually, without having the biggest questions, what are the operational gaps? And then start looking for the technology, and then combine the technology with the procedures. What I'm trying to say that technology by himself, it's not enough. Number three, I believe that one of the gaps we have is the Israeli nickname is Red Team. What does it mean? It means that we have a bunch of expertise that they have the responsibility to think not only out of the box, which is everybody happy to say out of the box, but they have to think what can be the next enemy scenario and ask themselves if this is the case, sometimes based on intelligence, sometimes based on their imagination, sometimes based on their best practice. But when they come with those potential new ideas, it forces the system to look for solutions, and by that, to be one step ahead before the terrorist. This is one of the main engines of the system. Somebody has to think like the enemy, provide new scenarios that will push the system to come with new solutions. And back to the combination between technology and Red Team is the, for example, let's take the 3D printers. This is a new technology that when somebody invests the money in order to produce it, he didn't think about what can be the applications from having the 3D printers. That Red Team has to think what the three-dimension printers can provide the enemies against us, and then start to develop concept and answers. And I'll give you small examples. You all know that we all shifting cargo by containers. And in most places, the best security steps is to seal the container with a sealer that the moment you close the door, you put kind of a sealer, and that's it. The three-dimension printer can print a new sealer within 12 minutes. All you have to do is to stop the car, pull it into a huge storages, take everything out, bring inside explosive, seal it again with the same sealer that was printed within 12 minutes, and then send them into the ports. Nobody will be able to recognize that somebody opened that container, and now you have totally different goods inside than what is written in the portfolio. This is a small example of how new technology can be used by the bad guys, and somebody has to think about those scenarios and come with solutions. And last but not least, I told my friends in the panel that we launched in Israel a few months ago kind of a new concept, using the social media networking as a safety and security networking. We developed an application, a new application. The name of the application is Mousquetaire, named after those three musketeers, one for all for one. And we believe that having a strong and large security and safety networking based on our social networks can provide us better feeling while we are walking on the streets or while we are traveling overseas. And I believe that that should be another tool in our box tool when we are dealing with terrorism and other bad element in our society. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the introduction. I'd like to turn this over now to Colonel Kemp and to create maybe the connection between Israel, lessons from Israel and the European context.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to echo Davis's thanks to the Wilfred Martin Centre for hosting this event today. Thank you. And thank you all very much for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here in Brussels. I don't know how many Belgians there are in this room, but I've had the pleasure of, I was going to say fighting, but serving alongside the Belgian army in the Balkans on at least one occasion, and very fine soldiers they were too. And it didn't surprise me when I saw the reports of the terrorist attack, which was stopped by Belgian soldiers shooting dead a terrorist attacker here in Brussels, because my experience of Belgian soldiers, they're extremely fine soldiers. They also like their beer almost as much as British soldiers do, but that's another issue. The high-level military group, the high-level home front group, Davis touched on it. This report here is what we're kind of talking about today. If you haven't got a copy, it's available on our website, which is hlmg.com.
No, high-level-military-group.com.
Okay, that's close. High-dash,
hlmg.com was taken.
high-dash, etc. And you can read it and download it. We carried out a visit to Israel, the high-level home front group, last year. And the members of it, I'm not going to mention every single one because some of the names I can't actually pronounce. But we had, as members of the group, I was a member, Lord David Trimble, who was a former First Minister of Northern Ireland and a Nobel Peace Prize winner. Lord Harris, on my left, was there. His biography's already been given. Yuri Rosenthal, who was a former Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. Robert Quick, former Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police for specialist operations, for counter-terrorist operations in effect. We had James Davies from the US, who had served in a high-level position in the FBI. Reginald Moore, also from the US, who served in the US Secret Service. And then somebody from Australia and an Israeli Brigadier General. So there was quite a depth of expertise, and we spent almost a week in Israel gaining access to pretty much everybody, every level involved in security, from the Prime Minister, who gave us a great deal of time, which I think reflects his commitment to security and his interest in basically helping to spread Israel's experience, because that's what our objective was really, was to learn what Israel had to teach and then to produce a report which would enable others to benefit from those lessons. And also encourage, I think, governments to work more closely with Israel in terms of sharing lessons. So that was a high-level home front group. If anyone's got any more questions about that, I'm happy to take them later when we come to questions. I just want to talk very briefly about, first of all, the threat in Europe as I see it, very briefly, a few points, and then I'll run through some points from this report and relate them to what's happening here in Europe and what's going to happen here in Europe. I'm not going to make any attempt to comprehensively cover the whole content of this. I'm sure Lord Harris will be touching upon some of it as well. But like I said, when it comes to questions, we can go through it in more detail. I mean, essentially, it doesn't need me to come and sit here in Brussels and tell you that the terrorist threat in Europe is extremely live, extremely active, extremely dangerous, and on the rise. And we've experienced that ourselves in London. In the last 6 weeks alone, we've had 8 serious terrorist plots directed against the United Kingdom. 5 of them were disrupted by our intelligence services, and the other 3 unfortunately succeeded. A suicide bombing in Manchester, a vehicle ramming and knifing in Westminster Bridge, and a vehicle ramming and knifings on London Bridge. So we're well aware of the threat. You here have experienced it, and in some of your countries, unfortunately, you've also experienced it. And I think to some considerable extent, this is due to 2 factors. The first factor being the rise and dominance of the Islamic State, which has not been stopped in its tracks. It should have been and could have been stopped in its tracks some years ago, but wasn't. And it shouldn't have been allowed to rise in the first place, but it was allowed to rise. And the influence and the inspiration that gives, both in terms of inspiring people remotely and directing people from the Islamic State, people traveling to fight with the Islamic State, traveling back, getting direction on the internet, making connections, and simply inspiration from the Islamic State, from the perceived success of the Islamic State. In the UK, and I'm sure it applies, I know it applies elsewhere in Europe as well, there has been increasing radicalization, not just via the internet, but also, I think, particularly in prisons, which presents us with a significant problem. And we've had, for example, highlighted in the media recently, a terrorist in Britain, convicted terrorist, who did the first of these type of attacks that we saw in Britain, which was in 2013, when 2 Islamic terrorists drove into a British soldier, off-duty British soldier on the streets of London, drove into him, got out of the car, and then started chopping him to pieces with meat cleavers and knives. And one of those is now has been highlighted in the media. He has been radicalizing lots of other people in jail, so that's a big problem. In the UK, we have our security services report that there are 23,000 jihadists in the UK who are of concern to MI5, our security service, of which 3,500 are of particular concern to the security service. Now, even that 3,500 is far too many to monitor, far too many to even think about monitoring. So something else needs to be done with as many of them as possible, other than just attempting to monitor the highest risk ones. Every single attack virtually we've seen, with some exceptions in Europe, we've known who the attackers were in advance. Intelligence has been aware of them. Yet, because we don't have the capability of monitoring them, we haven't been able to do anything about them or stop their attacks. A particularly dangerous aspect is the fact that the Islamic State is now being quite badly smashed up in both Iraq and in Syria, and many of them are returning. They're not going to go away. They're going to disperse, they're going to reform, they're going to transform themselves. They're extremely good at that. Many of them will come back. In the UK, and I use the UK as an example because I know more about it, but I'm sure similar figures apply in other European countries. We've had 400 Islamic State returners come back to the United Kingdom. We've killed 150 in Syria and Iraq, and there are another 400 ready to come back to the UK. The big danger with these people is it's like soldiers. If you train a soldier and get a soldier experienced in combat, he's a much better soldier for the next time. Well, these people have been raping, mass murder, torturing. They've got blood on their hands. They know how to do it, and it's easy for them to come back to our countries and do the same thing all over again. We haven't even really seen the beginning of that, in my view. We're going to get a lot worse from Islamic State returners. One additional point on the thread I want to make is that we should not fixate ourselves with vehicle rammings and knifings and even suicide bomb attacks that we've seen recently, because there's a tendency to say this is now the new form of attack. It isn't the new form of attack. There's every likelihood it will continue, but there will be other forms as well. And things, there'll be car bomb attacks, there'll be shootings, there'll be a range of other different types of attacks. There'll be copycat, there'll be inspiration taken from an attack, I think, probably the London Bridge attack was probably inspired by the Westminster Bridge attack. And that's the kind of pattern that we will probably sometimes see. Very difficult for our intelligence services to penetrate either individual groups of terrorists who only need a car and a knife. Maybe more easier if they've got to actually make explosives and assemble the equipment to make explosives and get onto the internet and find out how to do it, or travel overseas and get the training. But of course, they don't necessarily need nowadays to travel overseas. I think we've seen examples recently where they haven't traveled overseas. They've simply got the knowledge from the internet. That's my perception of the threat, which I think is very bad and is going to get a great deal worse in the months and years to come. I'm sorry to say, but that's what I think. Israel has got exceptionally hard-earned experience and capabilities in this specific threat area, which is why we went out to look at what they're doing. The recent attacks that have taken place in Israel have sort of matched, in many cases, the sort of attacks we've seen in Europe involving car rammings and knifings. Obviously, they've had other attacks as well, but those are some of the most recent predominant attacks. And as we're sort of alluding to, we have to learn from Israel. And not only do we have to learn from Israel, we have to stand by Israel in this fight, because the EU, I think, and the UK included in that, although we're not going to be in the EU much longer, but the UK and the EU together has not been as supportive of Israel as perhaps it should have been. Israel, in my personal experience, from the time that I was working for the British government and in liaison with most European countries and America, Israel was extremely helpful and useful to the UK in helping to counter our terrorist threat. We weren't necessarily as effective reciprocally as they were to us. And Nitzan said we should separate politics from practice. I don't think we can always do that. And those people who say that our terrorist attack is our misfortune, and it's terrible that we're getting attacked, but Israel actually deserves it. People that say that don't understand the situation in Israel. Israel does not deserve what it's getting. It's the same enemy as we fight, with the same motives, the same intentions, the same tactics. Our own leader of the opposition in the UK, Lord Harris's political party leader, Jeremy Corbyn, said, sorry, Lord Harris,
As you know, I'm a big fan.
It had to come out.
it had to come out. I thought I'd expose
No one's
that.
perfect.
He kind of almost he did actually blame the attack in Manchester on British foreign policy. It wasn't due to British foreign policy. It was due to the war that Islamic Jihad is fighting against us. In the same way as attacks in Israel are not due to settlements. There were attacks in Israel 100 years ago. There were no settlements 100 years ago. There have been attacks against Jews by Arabs in Israel for the last 100 years, regularly and frequently. This is not a matter of the kind of, the soundbite politics that people like to make out. It's not settlements. It's not so-called illegal occupation. That's simply not true, any more than it's not our foreign policy which inspires the attacks against us. It's not anyone's foreign policy that inspires one group of jihadists to bomb a mosque filled with a different sect in Pakistan or in Afghanistan or wherever else it is. Whose foreign policy is causing that? So I think it's important that we stand together against this threat that faces both of us in the same way. Very difficult for all of us to balance the security and protection with civil rights and civil liberties and human rights. It's an extremely hard balancing act. One of the things we found in our visit to Israel is that Israel manages that extremely well. It doesn't always work out for the best in either direction. Sometimes security is damaged by an Israeli court decision that certain actions can't be taken, which the security authorities think should be taken, and sometimes the court supports security action, and that damages human rights. So it's a balance, and there's give and take in both directions, unfortunately. And the question has to be asked. The same applies in the UK, the same applies in other countries. But I think one lesson we've brought out in this report is that countries can learn from the judicial experiences in Israel. They've got a great deal of it. They've got an extremely well-respected Supreme Court and judicial system. And there's a huge amount of case law that I think some of us can learn from in trying to wrestle with this problem ourselves. But one question that comes up is, whose human rights are most important? Is it the human rights of the suspect, the terrorist suspect, or is it the human rights of the children in the pop concert that they're planning to blow up? It's a balancing act that we have to juggle. Intelligence is a key issue. Intelligence comes out in this report very well. I mentioned the assistance Israel's given to us. My personal experience of Israel's provision of intelligence to the UK saved many British soldiers' lives in Afghanistan and Iraq and in the United Kingdom itself. And I know for a fact that that applies to most other European countries as well. And Israel has particularly good intelligence coverage in Iraq and Syria, and it's able to pass information to Britain, to France, to Belgium, to Germany on the threats being posed from the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq towards those countries, whether it's communications, whether it's movement of people or resources or whatever it might be. So that intelligence is absolutely vital. And again, it works in the other direction as well, but I think it's more of certainly a bit more of a one-way flow from Israel to us. Israel adopts a number of administrative and legal measures in relation to its terrorist threat. I'm going to run through some of them very briefly. But again, happy to pick it up in questions. They carry out administrative detention without trial for some terrorist suspect, not as a punishment, but as a preventive measure. So if there is their preference is to put them through the courts, as ours is. But if there are cases when they can't go through the courts, for example, the intelligence sources which give the information about a suspect's intent is so sensitive that it can't be exposed in open court, then how can you put it through the court? And if you do expose the source of the intelligence, then you risk other people dying because that source then is finished. And indeed, the person who is the source, if it's a human source, doesn't necessarily want to go to court, give the intelligence, and then get his head chopped off afterwards. So that's just one example of the reasons why it's sometimes necessary in Israel to carry out administrative detention, although it is always, I think, a last resort. And it's another measure I personally believe we should consider. We tried it in the UK, in Northern Ireland, a number of years back. It did not work. We made some serious mistakes. We wouldn't need to make those mistakes again. Control orders and other control measures against individuals, in other words, a judicial measure short of, I'm talking for too long.
3 more minutes.
Okay. Control orders, again, talk about that. House demolitions, that again is a deterrent that's used by Israel. Interestingly, it's done under British law, because we had a law when we ran Mandate Palestine, we had a British law that enabled house demolitions, and they've maintained that law. Again, it's not done lightly, and it's often turned down by the courts. Deportation, again, that doesn't necessarily apply quite so much, but movement, let's say somebody who's resident in the West Bank can be relocated to Gaza. Again, the courts very often turn that down. Again, it's a lesson that we could perhaps learn in our countries. Germany, I know we were talking about it earlier on, Germany is very proactive now in deportations. Britain less so, but I think we should become much more so in getting rid of these people out of the country that want to kill us and our children. Excluding IS returners, I mentioned the big threat from Islamic State returners, keeping them out, don't let them back. And we need to look carefully at how we do that from a judicial perspective. Just very briefly, because I have been banging on for too long, I apologize. I do love the sound of my own voice.
It's fascinating stuff, but
I know we got things to do.
Yeah.
Very briefly, I think one issue that is quite notable in Israel is the inclusion of private sector security companies and private individuals in the team effort. Certainly in Britain, we tend to see these are the authorities, they're very important people. That lot over there, they just should get out of the way and let them do the job. In Israel, I think they have far greater reliance on the civilian community, the population at large, to help them deal with the problem. And they've got, I think, something like 30,000 people with firearms, private civilians with firearms. And of course, we shouldn't forget that, that every single person, with very few exceptions in Israel, is a trained soldier. And I think I will, my 3 minutes is up, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, we'll get back to many of the topics that you raised. I would, at this point, I would also like to add to this, if you want an example of cooperation with Israeli experts here in Brussels, look at Zaventem Airport. It's a place that many of you are passing through regularly. And you remember the time after the attacks last year when it was dysfunctional for several months because the authorities and the airport security were not up to the task, and how smoothly it is running now. And the change is largely due to Israeli expertise. Very simply, they got the pros to help with advice how to secure an airport while making it or keeping it efficient. So it's both more secure and more efficient than in the months after the 22nd of March 2016. All right, Lord Harris, what is happening at the home front now in Europe?
Well, thank you very much. And can I say I found it a privilege, actually, to be part of the Homefront group which visited Israel. We were treated with a great deal of openness, honesty, and senior access, and they put up with our criticisms, our concerns, and the issues that we were raising. As it happened, it coincided with my being commissioned by the new Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, to review London's preparedness to respond to a major terrorist attack. And I think what I found fascinating was how many parallels and lessons could be learned from the Israeli visit. Now, in Israel, of course, the context is different. We accept that. The threat is constant, it's persistent, it's repeated. You see the shootings, the random knife attacks, the vehicles used as weapons happening on an almost daily basis. And in Israel, there is a constant barrage of incitement and propaganda glorifying martyrs, which inevitably has an effect on the susceptible, including those who perhaps in other contexts would be simply deemed as having mental health problems. So looking at some of that, and in particular some of the threats and the way in which they were responding to them, was very interesting then to apply to the London context and some of the issues that we face in terms of preparing for a terrorist incident. Now, in the case of my review for the Mayor of London, my conclusion was that London's preparedness to respond to an incident was now much better than it was 5 or 6 years before, when I had previously been heavily involved. And tragically, as has been indicated, we have since seen a series of major terrorist incidents in the UK, some of which have been in London. And the response to those, I think, was very interesting and very speedy. So on the 22nd of March of this year, an individual drove his car into tourists and others on Westminster Bridge. He killed 4 people and then went on to stab a police officer to death within the precincts of the Houses of Parliament before himself being shot dead by another police officer. Now, while that incident was going on, I was in a meeting just over the area where the guy was ultimately shot and where he killed the policeman. I was barricaded in with colleagues because the initial message was that there was gunfire on the parliamentary estate, which was actually the shooting of the terrorist. But at that stage, we thought there was a sort of live gun incident going on. But the point I want to make is that incident, from the point at which the guy drove his car onto the pavement on Westminster Bridge, killing several people, then crashing it into a barricade, getting out, arming himself with a knife, running round the corner, coming into the entrance of Parliament and stabbing the police officer, and then himself being shot dead, lasted precisely 82 seconds. Now, we are talking about one of the most heavily policed areas of the United Kingdom, possibly of Europe, but nonetheless, 82 seconds give you some indication of the speed of the incident. The attack on London Bridge, the Borough Market attack on the 3rd of June, the police were on the scene within 2 minutes, paramedics from the London Ambulance Service within 6, and the 3 terrorists were shot dead just 8 minutes after the first emergency call. And I think my point about that is that we all have to be, all societies, all of us in this room have to be ready to respond with that degree of speed, and we have to look at how we can make that happen. But there's a simple message here that you cannot guarantee security. I think those response times in London, indeed this is what I'd already advised the Mayor, were pretty good. But my warning was, you cannot guarantee security. And 2 minutes, 4 minutes, or 6 minutes, whatever it turns out to be, that is an eternity for those individuals who are caught up in the incident concerned. What is more, we were comparatively lucky in those dreadful incidents in London, in that the individuals concerned were simply using vehicles and were simply using knives. Had they been armed with automatic weaponry, there could have been dozens killed in those events. And even if you had a level of response available that would have cut those response times in half, you would still have had many people killed. So there's ultimately a trade-off. And ultimately a trade-off that has to be made between how much are you ready to invest in increasing that security to improve the response rate, and the effect of that on the nature and fabric of the city. You go around London and you will not, apart from around the Palace of Westminster, you will not notice many armed police officers. I can assure you that they're there, but it's not very visible. But it's still possible to produce that response rate. You could reduce that response time, but it would mean far more armed police officers. That would change the look and feel of the city. And there's a question which you have to decide as to what is the balance between, you'll never guarantee security, reducing that death toll maybe slightly, and how you change the nature of the way in which the city operates. And I think it's a choice, certainly a difficult choice for politicians. I think it's a difficult choice for all of us. What do we find acceptable? What is our acceptance of the degree of risk? And all of these things have a trade-off. Richard described some of the measures that they take in Israel. Now, those are judgment calls. To what extent do you take measures against a terrorist's family? How effective is that in terms of deterrence compared with the effect on perhaps inciting others that this is all part of a narrative which suggests that the state is against them and that there is discrimination against their particular faith? And that is the choice that constantly has to be made. There are no easy answers to any of these things. There isn't a right or wrong answer. Ultimately, it's a matter of judgment. You could have, you could respond more quickly, but what are the other costs of doing that? I made in my report to the Mayor 127 recommendations. Many of those were about physical issues or practical issues about the relationships between the various emergency services and the different agencies. And the responses we started with from Nitzan were absolutely right. You need to exercise these processes, because unless the different agencies have worked out what to do, how to do it, and how to respond, they will not be ready when the occasion arises. Immediately following the attack in Manchester, the UK government implemented what's called Operation Tempora, which is using the armed forces in support of the civil police. Now, that is something I'd looked at as part of my review. And when I looked at it as part of my review, one of my conclusions was you need to try this out for real first. You need to actually do some trials of this. It's all very well on paper. I'd speak to people in the military, I'd speak to people in the police, and they had a different view as to what was going to happen and how it was going to work. You do not have the luxury in the middle of an incident to work out what the protocols are. And you can't work the protocols out in a vacuum unless you've tried them out in some sort of exercise. So who has supremacy? It's now established that in virtually all circumstances, it would be the police would have supremacy and the soldiers would be operating on the instruction of the police and accompanying the police. But you need to work that out in advance. You can't just make it up at the moment that the incident happens. So there's a need to prepare in that sort of way. I think the other point which I was struck with visiting Israel, and we have a lot of CCTV, a lot of cameras in the UK, and the population by and large accepts that and doesn't feel that its liberties are infringed. What was impressive in Israel was where there's perhaps a similar level of cameras, is how well integrated the various systems are. So that when it's necessary, the police can call up images from cameras in shops, cameras on the street, everything else, to try and track down what's happening and to be aware of it. Now, that's a capacity which is partly available in the UK, but it's very patchy, and a lot more could be done on that. Mention has been made about the private sector and the security the security industry. In London, there are 100,000 security guards who are registered with what's called our Security Industry Authority. They go through some basic checks, I have to say very basic checks. I'm not absolutely convinced that these necessarily weed out people who you might want to weed out, but they go through some checking. They get some rudimentary training. But that's 100,000 potentially uniformed people. That is 3 times the entire police force in London. Now, in the event of an incident, what is the role of those individuals? Are they trained? As far as the public are concerned, here's a guy in a uniform, a guy or girl in a uniform, they must know what's going on and they'll tell us what to do. Now, if those people have never been trained adequately in how to respond to an individual incident, then that's not going to work. But potentially, there is an enormous resource there. With modern technology, you could be giving them special briefings, individual briefings in terms of what needs to happen at a particular time. You could be passing messages to them. That, again, is all possible, but you need to do that. You need to have a partnership. During the London Bridge attack, which these were the guys who, first of all, used their van to ram people on London Bridge. They then got out with 30-centimetre long ceramic knives taped to their arms and started attacking people in a sort of little restaurant area in Borough Market. Interesting, complete contrast. Some of the staff, the people at the front of the restaurants, invited people in the street in to be safe inside the premises. Others, they closed the doors, barred them out, and kept people out. Now, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to that, because it depends exactly who it is you're inviting in. But again, making up that judgment in the middle of an attack without having thought it through or without preparing in advance for it or rehearsing it, I think is very difficult. And that was, again, something that we saw from Israel. The mention has also been made of everybody should be engaged in this. Now, in the UK and in some European citizens, the number of people who have had military service is comparatively small. In Israel, it's virtually everybody. But we all need to know, as individual citizens, what is the right response, what to do. We all have a contribution. It's not just the emergency services, it's not just the police, the fire service, or the civic authorities that should know what to do or have considered this. Everybody has a responsibility. Everybody should be entering into this. One of my recommendations, for example, is that we haven't had an attack in the UK so far, and I hope never will, on a school. But most schools have thought about what happens if a fire breaks out, and they have a fire evacuation plan. But they've never thought about what to do if there is a hostile intruder. And it's actually the opposite of what you do if there's a fire. If there's a fire, you evacuate the building, get everyone onto the playground. If it's a hostile intruder who may have weapons, you actually want to bring people into a safe space. Now, that's something you sort of thought about and rehearsed. So I think my simple message, and I saw a lot of it in Israel where they've thought about mitigation for all sorts of types of attacks, is expect the unexpected and make sure everyone is engaged in the process. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think there's a lot of food for thought here. I would like to give you the possibility now to ask questions or express opinions if they're short. Please introduce yourselves if you have a question or comment. Sir, in the third row, right here. Can we bring the microphone? There is a mic coming.
Thank you. My name is Rudy Roth. I'm an investigative reporter, but I've been involved in security and international banking networks many years before. And I feel very young when I hear Nissan speaking, because it's the same principles with new technology, with same ideas who have to be applied. So you have to be creative to do that. Now, one question about what we applied in our security, and that was financial security and not human security, of course. We made the security at that level so that those who would try to get into the system would do it elsewhere, because the cost was too high to get in our system. So they would go to the banks, our members, because it was probably less secure. Now, using that mentality, the question is, can you apply the same logic to terrorists, so that the cost to attack either a city, London, or a place would be too high for them and they would do it somewhere else? Or the cost for them would be much too high to do it by any means, and not only physical or financial means, financial cost, but human cost for them as well. I know they don't care about suicide, but there are still things they think about. So is that something that you count in your system or not? Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. That's understood. Let's collect a few more points and questions. Yes, Monsieur Al-Barakat. Microphone right.
Thank you very much. You spoke about Zaventem and the Israeli experience, but I went to Zaventem several times after the attacks And it's true that in the building, when you enter to Zaventem, there were a lot of control. But in the parking of the airport, you arrive there and you have more than 100, maybe more than 150 persons there. They leave their cars, or the other cars put them there so as to go to the airport before the control. And if I am a terrorist, I can go there and I make what I want to do, without any control. I entered there several times and there were no control. I don't know what is the experience in this. Thank you very much.
All right, that was clear. The third question from the lady in the second row, right here.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is more towards Richard Kemp. I almost felt like there was a slight generalization when talking about terrorism, in the sense that, okay, we can sort of learn from the Israeli experience, but surely tackling lone wolves, even if they're sort of, you know, in a way affiliated to ISIS, is not the same as tackling Hezbollah or even Hamas. I mean, I can see how there are some similarities, but I feel like terrorist groups as such are much more predictable than just somebody who maybe sort of agrees with the sort of message that ISIS puts out, but, you know, hasn't trained or doesn't know anyone who's actually a part of the organization, if we want to call it that. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Thanks very much. I think there was one more question in this area here. Yes, madam. And then we have a round of answers.
Yes, my name is Ines von Beer. I'm the director of the European Leadership Network here in Brussels. So first of all, big compliments. I really enjoyed all the presentations, very interesting indeed. Since we're here in Brussels, I would love to have a perspective or recommendations from our Israeli but also UK speakers on how you see EU policy making with regard to counterterrorism after, you know, you've been to Israel and you made the experience, but maybe also from Nitzan, some very concrete examples, how you see the EU should develop in terms of counterterrorism policy making. Thanks.
Excellent questions. Okay, a fifth one, right here. In the middle.
Yes, hello. I have a simple question for all these speakers. Do you think the war on terror works? And if you do, if you think it does, then if you could give me an example. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
That's the mother of all questions, right? Okay. All right. So we have a very general question. Does it work? Is it working? We have a question of the EU response. We have the dichotomy or the difference between the lone wolves and the Hezbollah, Hamas, and other organized terrorist groups. We have the Zaventem question. I understood as. Is it possible to actually take the terrorist threat far enough away from large groups of people in places like airports or railway stations? And there was a question, can you somehow guide or second guess or somehow influence the choice of targets of terrorist attacks? So not everyone should answer every question, just make your pick. And maybe let's start with Nitzan. Pick one of those, please. Maybe the Hezbollah lone wolf thing.
Well, yes, that's not true.
Generally speaking, the question was, can we deter terrorism? Can we deter someone that already decided to commit suicide? I believe that the answer is yes. That goes to your questions, does the work against terrorism really works? I believe that even the lonely wolf, those who, let's say, decided in the middle of the night after a dream or reading something or watching TV that they want tomorrow morning to kill somebody. From our experience, from our perspective, first and foremost, you need to study the way those lonely wolves are thinking, what motivates them. And if you study all the chain of the phenomena, then you can start develop concept how to deal with. And I'll follow your example dealing with those lonely wolves. saying that we find out that most of the time, somebody pushed them to take the actions. It's not really their own ideas. They read something, they copy somebody, they calculate sometimes even finance issues, because unfortunately the Palestinian Authority pay them after they commit suicide and the family get money. So if you understand all the chain of taking those decisions, you can start build up a deterrence program or a prevention approach. Just lately, it was published yesterday, so we can speak about it very openly. The Israeli head of the National Security Agencies just informed the public that we succeeded to stop more than 2,000 lonely wolf in the area of the West Bank just by monitoring the social media. So it's not easy to monitoring so many people, but in that case, technology helps us a lot. And again, you need to build up the concept saying how you are going to monitor those people, what are the main issues that really interest you, and when you get those, let's say, hints or intelligence, what are the steps you have to take in order to capture the bad guys. By the results, I can tell you that we are doing a very good job. If there is 100% success, the answer is no. And for your questions, can we prove that war against terrorism works? I need to start with a very bad news. Terrorism is going to stay with us forever, and we need to study how to live with that very bad behaviors. Like we study how to live with criminality. None of us like thieves. None of us likes robbers, rapers, but they are living among us. And the only thing that we are asking for the agencies is to keep it in the level which we can live with. The same thing with terrorism. I cannot express what could be without fighting terrorism. What was the amount of suicide bombers, car bombs, and others without fighting against those bad people? And those who are thinking that because we are fighting terrorism, terrorism exists, do not read the right books. They need to go to a different movie. The fact that terrorism exists is not because we are fighting terrorism. Terrorism exists because many other reasons. Some of them we can control, some of them we cannot control. And we need to have all the expertise, all the connections we can in order to keep it as low as we can.
Thanks. Thanks very much. Let's move on.
Okay, I'll briefly mention a couple of points on probably most of those topics. The first one on the subject of deterrence against terrorism. Can it work? Yes, it can work, and sometimes it fails. Interestingly, I had a similar experience to you. I was once responsible for a major commercial area's security in London, and my objective was to make sure that that terrorists attacked somewhere else, not my place. I wanted them to go to your place. That's great for an individual, let's say, commercial security organization, but of course that's not what we want from a police force. We don't want them to deflect them somewhere else. But I think it sort of touches on the point raised by Lord Harris of the fact that in London we don't have a very high visibility armed police presence, and perhaps if we did, it would be more of a deterrent. I don't know, maybe not, but I think someone mentioned the point, and often people do mention the point, that you can't deter a suicide attacker. Yes, you can deter a suicide attacker, because although a suicide attacker is prepared to kill themselves in order to go to heaven and get all his virgins, and there's also a theory on why female suicide attackers do it, but I'm not going to mention it now. But he's prepared to do that, but he doesn't want to get arrested before he does it, or shot and killed before he does it. So if he thinks there's a high price to be paid, which is his life, then that's potentially a good deterrent against even a suicide attacker. And the Israeli method I mentioned of house destruction and deportation or moving to a different area, things like that, punishment of a family. Now, it goes against most of what we most want to see. I mean, it sounds terrible even though it was a British law in the first place. But it sounds terrible, and it is terrible. But they don't do it really. Obviously, if a suicide bomber blows up and kills a bunch of civilians, they don't demolish the house of that suicide bomber to punish him because he's dead already. But they do it to deter, so that a future suicide bomber knows that normally he will actually be paid, his family will be paid, shall we say, compensation for his death and potentially a salary for the rest of their lives from your taxes, by the way, that you pay to the Palestinian Authority or to works its way to Hamas, who then pay the families of the terrorists. So we're actually supporting terrorism financially through our taxes. But as long as that's communicated, as long as everyone knows that if I blow myself up and kill a bunch of Israelis, then my family's not going to be better off. They're not going to have a house to live in. That will deter me. And if there's no other way of deterring, maybe that is a reasonable option. It's repellent to most of us, but maybe it is. The choke points business that you mentioned, where you have security checkpoints and then people build up beyond that and it presents a target. I think it's almost unavoidable if you're going to have any form of security. And what we saw in the Manchester attack, I think I'm right in saying this, that there was security to prevent people getting into the main arena, and the attacker, the suicide attacker, blew himself up outside the security checkpoint. Oh, yeah. Now, again, it may be that if he'd been able to get in, he'd have done a lot more damage and killed a lot more people. And equally, we had a major attack in Kabul recently, car bomb, which killed, I think, in excess of 100 people. And it was, again, at a checkpoint or beyond a checkpoint. So it is really hard. It's almost impossible, I think, to stop all possibilities. But we do what we can. EU policy making on counterterrorism. What happens when you let lots of refugees come into a country, or alleged refugees come into a country from a place where jihadism is rife? We've seen what happens. We get a lot of terrorism. So you have to seriously think about who you let in and who you don't let in. Virtually impossible to screen them. And of course, we can't just say, well, your life's in danger, you're risking getting killed, we won't let you into our country. We have to look at how we can best help them. And Britain had a policy. I think Britain's policy has been to try and help them by not bringing them into our country, but helping them in areas adjacent to their own places. And things like maybe creating safe havens, etc., in the countries where they're at risk. That might be less of a threat. Border control, obviously, very, very important. Something that the EU does not tolerate and does not permit. That needs to be brought back in. We need to have ways of controlling movement of people, say, from Belgium to blow themselves up in France. And then we need to look at deportation of people who are suspect, who we believe are likely to carry out a terrorist attack. They need to go back to where they came from, as long as we've got sufficient evidence to justify it. Not necessarily in court, an open court process, but through maybe special court arrangements. Does the war on terrorism work? You can't say a war works. You either win or lose the war, and different campaigns within it, according to the tactics and operations used. He really touched on it. And I think, and I agree totally with what Nitzan said, that we're not being attacked because of the way that we're fighting back. I mean, the first attack, let's not forget, the first major attack in this war on terror. And war on terror, of course, is a euphemism for war against violent Islam, which essentially was declared against us by them and manifested itself in the greatest possible way on 9/11, which was not as a result of any of our, war on terrorism tactics, because it didn't exist then. But obviously some things work, some don't. As I mentioned before, we could easily, I think, have dealt with the Islamic State and the problem that presented at a much earlier stage by being far more aggressive and far more decisive in our bombing campaigns against them in Syria and Iraq.
Thank you very much for your frank language. I think that's exactly, to address issues directly is exactly the way to talk about these very complex questions. Lord Harris.
Yeah, I'll try not to respond both to everything that my colleagues have said and to every single point. But, I mean, on the war on terror, this is it's a catchphrase. I don't think it was necessarily terribly helpful of George W. Bush to label it in those terms. But allowing the creation of ungoverned space where these groups can gain power and sway and train people and then disseminate what happened is not sensible policy. Now, there is an argument which says to have dealt with the Taliban in Afghanistan and removed Saddam Hussein in Iraq without an exit plan, which then avoided the dangers of creating ungoverned space, was a mistake. But the principle of trying to avoid areas of the world where you are, where there are regimes or it is possible to flourish, training people to attack other parts of the world is entirely sensible. Whether you can ever win it is another matter, because I think this is a long-standing generational issue. I also wanted to pick up at the point about lone actors. I felt the point that you were making was actually in Israel they're not lone actors. My understanding, and you know, the general will know far more about it than I am, but it's interesting again in the discussions we had, was that a lot of the individuals are themselves lone actors, but they're in an environment in which they are bombarded by propaganda, which is coming from those organised groups, but they are individuals. And it is also quite interesting listening to the research that they have done in Israel on, you know, what is the lead time for some of these individuals in terms of becoming terrorists? You know, you would find, looking at the social media, no sign a week before, 2 days before, even the day before, that this was a person who was going to do this. Then something happens in their lives and they go out and do it. Now, they might have thought about doing these things without that barrage of constant propaganda. But it's interesting, it was an incident. I wanted to just mention, while I was doing my review in London, there was a stabbing in Russell Square. And this turned out not to be a terrorist incident, although the response of the police was on the basis it might have been a terrorist incident. This was somebody who started attacking passers-by. The individual was, in fact, detained and subdued in less than 6 minutes, which is quite, again, a sign of speed. But the court was subsequently told, well, he wasn't shot dead, which might have happened elsewhere. The court was subsequently told he was suffering from an acute episode of paranoid schizophrenia, therefore attacked passers-by and tragically killed an American tourist. The point about it is that it turns out he was a Muslim. Now, he wasn't, as it turns out, motivated by an Islamist ideology. But had he shouted out Allah Akbar during the course of that, which he might have done just as a Muslim, it would no doubt have been characterized as a terrorist incident rather than a mental health incident. I think the dividing line between mental health cases, in some cases, and someone which is an organised terrorism, given that there is this atmosphere of projecting it, the copycats which will take place is a very difficult one and something we all need to be conscious of. And it may also say something about what we need to be doing in terms of our own mental health care policies. I want to just pick up one point about the diversion of attacks. You know, when I did this review on London, and London is better resourced to deal with terrorism than most other parts of the UK, one of the criticisms I got was from other parts of the country saying, yeah, okay, you can handle these incidents in so many minutes. It wouldn't be like that in our part of the country because it would take 40 minutes for the armed response vehicle to get there. And that's inevitably the case. What you have to look at, though, is what are the terrorists trying to do? And they want iconic sites. They want mass casualties. And you have to distribute your resources to recognize that. But as I've said throughout my presentation, you cannot eliminate the risk entirely, and that's an issue. Moving the boundaries is not a solution either. One of the consequences of spending time thinking about this is you become acutely conscious of your surroundings and the extent to which you are vulnerable. So I went to the theatre with my wife in central London. Very good. There's a bag check going on in the theatre, and they're going through everybody's bag and so on. So we're going to be fine when we get in there. There's a huge queue down the street without bollards or anything else of people waiting to go into the theatre. That's the point at which I feel nervous. I don't feel nervous once I've got into the theatre. And that's a real issue. It's a real issue for the authorities about how you manage crowds, manage perimeters, so as to minimize creating a new target, which is actually easier for the terrorists to use. Finally, on EU policy making, I think do not underestimate the advantage of exchanging information, exchanging tactics, learning from each other. That's hugely important. Nobody has a monopoly of wisdom on any of these things. Learn from what other people are doing, including about diverting people from terrorist activity, about communications, all of those things. So that's a huge advantage. The other point is make sure that there are proper intelligence flows between the different agencies. One of the concerns I have, Richard and I don't agree entirely on the question of whether the UK should leave the EU. One of my concerns about Brexit is that we will, one way or another, cut ourselves off from the flow of intelligence and information and collaboration, which is an essential part of dealing with these problems.
Thanks very much. I actually also believe that in the post-Brexit UK-EU relationship, security, and that includes defense, but also counter-terrorism, may actually play a very positive role. That if it's handled well, it may actually spill over positively to the other areas of the relationship.
You have a very optimistic view
Yes,
of the skills of the negotiators on both sides to be sensible and produce a good outcome.
Yes, thank you. I think everyone understood this. Now, I have a question to all of you. The most recent terrorist attack in the UK was actually on Muslims coming out of an Islamic community centre, and it was obviously motivated by hatred against Muslims. Is this kind of, would you label this a backlash? How much potential is there for more of this? What would you say?
So
yeah, start with you.
I wouldn't classify that as a terrorist attack. And the reason I would...
But it was.
Well, I would say
it wasn't. It was classified as
yes,
one.
it was. It was immediately classified as one. The government and media were head over heels to be the first to call it a terrorist attack. But I don't think it was a terrorist attack. Maybe it was, but we haven't actually established the full motives of the individual that did it. But from what a terrorist attack, to my mind, involves violence or some other form of force against individuals for political purposes. Now, I think that was a hate crime, and it was possibly a revenge attack, but I don't think you could necessarily class it as terrorism. Maybe that's a semantic point. It doesn't matter too much for our purposes. I think the fact is that we're going to see more of that, unfortunately, and I think what we need to do, what our governments need to do, is to get a far bigger grip on the situation that's facing us now, unless they want to see more of it. We're constantly warned of backlashes against the Muslim community. They don't really happen. All we've seen up until the point of that attack in the UK has been verbal abuse, maybe lots of stuff on the internet, things like all horrible stuff, and which should not be directed against innocent members of the Muslim community in Britain, who in many cases, probably most cases, are just as horrified as we are by the terrorist attacks that some members of their community carry out. So we shouldn't tolerate that, but we haven't really seen anything of that nature before. But I think we will, because people are getting increasingly angry at what is happening. And it's not just in relation to terrorist attacks, it's also in relation to large numbers of Muslim rape gangs that have been carrying out hundreds of rapes against young non-Muslim girls throughout the United Kingdom. Now, that people equate these two things together, whether it's right to do that or wrong to do that is another issue, but they do that. And I think we are going to see what actually the Islamic State and other jihadist organizations want to see, which is division in our societies and violence and civil war. And it will come to that unless our governments take action to stronger action than they are now to stop it.
But just to come in on this one, then you might say that governments should maybe serve even more of the rhetoric that they have been serving after this attack, or after all terrorist attacks in the UK recently. We're all one society, we're all one big community. Those are not real Muslims, and the vast majority of us who actually want to live together in peace, and we can live together in peace, and so on. And anger is not the right reaction. That was the kind of the overtone of all these reactions against after the terrorist attacks. Well, is that helpful or is it not helpful?
Well, I think it's certainly helpful and vital and essential for the government to. For any government to stress the fact that we don't want to see violence, that it's what is playing into the hands of the terrorists, and we should be fighting it together. But we also need to see action from them, I think. And what we see more than action is weakness. And just as one example, within a few days of the London Bridge attack, we had a parade through the streets of London with Hezbollah flags, the flags of a prescribed terrorist organization, being waved on the streets of London. Now, that caused enormous anger among many people who thought it was quite wrong to do that. But so unless, the rhetoric is one thing, but actually it needs to be matched with action, and that parade should have been banned, as simple as that, in my opinion. I mean, obviously that wasn't the opinion of the politicians.
All right. Lord Harris.
I live quite close to the Finsbury Park Mosque, have done for years. It's had an interesting history. The mosque. I think when my oldest son, who's now in his mid-30s, was in primary school, one of his friends was a little Muslim girl there, and the mother got quite friendly with my wife. And the mother complained to my wife that her husband, she was very concerned about because he was spending too much time in the mosque. And there are bad men in the mosque, is what she said. Now,
it's one way to put it.
They've allegedly they have, I am sure, cleaned their act up since then. And there was an instance when the police raided the mosque, which is quite a big deal, raiding a place of worship. But there are some interesting lessons. I think Richard makes the point, was this a terrorist attack? Actually, the definition of terrorism is not straightforward. There are people academics, there may be some in this room, who make a good living from writing learned articles trying to define what terrorism actually is. If you blow up a train because you like seeing explosions, is that terrorism? No, there may not be a political motivation, but actually, as far as the public are concerned, it doesn't make much difference. And I think there are some important messages which came from the attack in Finsbury Park. One is that the response should be just as vigorous as it would be against a parallel attack against non-Muslims. Secondly was the message that this guy was detained by other people, by people coming out of the mosque, and the imam told them not to kill him, told them not to beat him up, and wait for the police to arrive. I mean, I think he got a black eye, but that's probably not unexpected. But I mean, there's a question here of demonstrating, and this is important, that the vast majority of the Muslim population in our country, and I suspect in all the countries here, are not Islamists who want to wage that war. And I think drawing that line and demonstrating that the authorities are on the side of those sensible, moderate people who believe in a civilized society is actually an extremely important one. The other thing I just mention, because it's interesting, is that I was at a meeting in the Home Office yesterday, and one of the things we were talking about is the PREVENT scheme, which isn't 100% successful, but the PREVENT scheme, which is designed to try and prevent people becoming violent extremists. There are parts of the UK, parts of England, where 2/3 of the referrals are from the extreme right. People who are of the extreme right who are concerned that they are going to become terrorists and attack other people. Now, that may be that the PREVENT programme isn't hitting all the targets it should be. But it's quite interesting that there are those levels of strand. And if we are concerned about having a peaceful society, we need to address all elements of that sort of extremism if that is what it's going to lead to violent attacks on other citizens?
Thanks very much. Yes, a brief round. 3 questions, not more. We start with the lady here in the third row. Yes. There's a microphone next to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm Charlotte Gutmann. After 40 years in public relations, I believe I became a professional. And my question would be, if this kind of report gets into the wrong hands, what is your opinion and what could be the damages? Thank you.
Yeah, what if the enemy reads the learned articles that we write? Good question. Madam? Behind you, Andre.
Hello. My name is Saskia, and I like to represent the law-abiding and the innocent citizen. I think we need...
Can you speak up a little?
Okay.
Or closer to you?
I would like to represent the law-abiding and innocent citizen. Like all of us, in a way. We are informed. I think we need a public information campaign to sensibilize people. As Mr. Nouriel said, in Israel, the citizens are prepared and trained to be vigilant and just to be able to see what happens around them and to inform. And is there an EU policy for this? If I would, I don't know, I am Belgium. I think if I would utter this here in Belgium, people would think I am paranoid. That is a step too far.
Okay.
So, and I think there is a lot of denial and ignorance, so maybe we can do something.
Right. Thanks very much. And the last, no, sorry, you already had one. Was there someone else? Okay, then Monsieur Barakat. But really brief. There's a microphone next to you on the other side.
Thank you very much. Barakat, it means chance, and I have the chance to have the question. You speak about, I'd like to ask you, don't you think that it's better to fight the roots of this terrorism? You spoke about what's happening in Gaza and West Bank of Jordan. You know better than me the conditions in which people there are living. Don't you think that it's better to find a political solution so as not to oblige Palestinians to be terrorists? When you have in Gaza 2 hours electricity a day, in the West Bank of Jordan, checkpoints everywhere, and the occupation which is happening since 1967 and all these things. And also, don't you think that it's better not to call it Islamic terrorism? They are criminals. How can you explain the fact that these guys who are not Muslims, they sell heroin, drugs, and when after the operations, after examination, there's blood, they are drunk, and you know, I can't imagine that these guys can be called Muslims. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Very pertinent questions, and we start with Nitzan.
Yeah, I'll try to be very brief. The enemy always study what we are doing. It's ongoing competition. They study what we are doing. Therefore, we need to refresh our routine. We need to build up a new deterrence. It's not a question of hiding what we are doing, because what we are doing is published, and the enemy study what we are doing. And we need to understand that lessons learned works for the both sides. We study them, they study us. It's kind of the nature of the conflict. Number one. Number two, how to prepare the population. It always a tense between how to keep everything which will not be under a panic. I don't want to be the public be under a panic. Terrorism, it's a very bad issue we need to deal with. We need to teach the people how to behave. It should start from the kindergarten. It should go to the schools, to universities. But we need to keep it in balance, because it's very easy to drive us crazy and to destroy our life, which is one of the main terror achievements. And therefore, we need to find a balance. I hope that the EU will find a balance. I believe that in Israel we found the balance, how to practice a lot, how to teach the people what to do, and at the same time keep walking to movies, to cinemas, to concert, to sport, big events, and so far and so on. For your questions, I need at least 2 hours. So I'll try to be very, very brief. I'm not so sure that everybody has so much time. I warmly recommend you to speak with me privately. I'll be
there will be an opportunity
with a lot of patience to say whatever you want. Raising the questions, who started the conflict, it's not relevant. The question is who is willing to solve it. The question is who is willing to compromise, who is willing to provide solutions. And when you ask, or when you raise the issue of Gaza, and that will be just a small example. Israel left Gaza in May 2005. I was there. We have no claim from Gaza. Gaza, by all means, can be a state. And the leaders of Gaza decided to keep fighting with us instead of build up their own state. If the Hamas leaders take tomorrow morning a decision that they want 20 years of ceasefire with Israel and take all the money they have and invest in order to have electricity, water, and you name it, they can do it. Nobody stand in front of them. No one. Israel has one small condition that if this is the case and we have no claim from Gaza, they should disarm themselves. And if the only thing they have to do is to say yes. And from the first minute, they can build up their own place. And it's not a joke. We are saying in Israel that Gaza can be the Singapore of the Middle East. Yes, they can. They have their own natural gas sources that they can develop. They can solve all their own problems by themselves because money is not an issue. It's a question of management, but above all, it's a question of decisions. What do you want to be? Do you want to be a state or you want to fight forever, even though you know that you will never achieve your goals? So it's not a question who starts the war, it's a question who is willing to finish it. And I believe that we are in the side which we are willing to finish it.
Thanks very much. Now let's focus on Europe here in your final words.
Okay, I still want to just say a word about that final point. Because let's be clear, the narrative which is given to persuade people to become violent extremists, of course it draws on individual conflicts. It draws on what is right or wrong in Gaza, what is right or wrong in Kashmir, in Chechnya, or whatever it might be. But if you took one element away, it doesn't stop the single narrative. The single narrative continues. So, yes, of course, lessen the tension if you can, if people are prepared to, in those areas. But let's not delude ourselves that removing one particular reason will necessarily stop some of the things that are going on. Can this get into the wrong hands? I think it's written in such a way that even if it got into the wrong hands, it wouldn't necessarily contain anything which surprises them. I was faced with exactly this when I was asked by the Mayor of London to do this exercise. I spoke to his people and they said, we want you to do this review. So, okay, is this a public review? Oh, yes, we're going to announce it. It's fine. So you want a report at the end. So if I find that there is some massive hole in London's defences, you want me to put that in a public report? No, that's a problem. Perhaps you need to produce two reports, a public report and a private report. Well, that doesn't work in a democratic society because people are always interested in the private report. So it is a dilemma. But I do think in an open society you have got to be prepared to talk about these issues and to consider them. But often things which are kept secret on the basis that this will help the enemy, turns out the enemy know perfectly well already. And, you know, some of the terrorist groups that I've looked at, what they've been up to, their statecraft, their ability to avoid surveillance is of a very high order. So there's, you know, let's not get too carried away about this. Finally, on citizens, the my general theme is that we've all got to be part of this. But let's not build it up as being that you've got to change your entire way of life. As children, we're taught how to cross the road. In Britain, the mantra when I was taught this was look left, look right, look left again. That's because we drive on the wrong side of the road, as far as you're concerned. And before you cross, it's ingrained in people. It's the same sort of thing that you need to do now to ingrain in people good cybersecurity habits and good general security habits about vigilance. So it's just something we ought to build up so that we're all part of it and all part of the solution.
Very briefly, I'll return to
pick one point.
Quick 1 point, okay. 10 minutes?
Yeah.
I'll be quick. I'll very briefly return to the point I made at the beginning of my previous remarks. And I think probably the attitude that Israel has it coming, which you were pretty much expressing, that the checkpoints, the so-called problems with electricity in Gaza, the so-called illegal occupation, these things really mean Israel has it coming. I think that kind of attitude, but not by yourself or me or him, but by our governments and by the United Nations and by the EU and other large-scale organizations, I think encourages terrorism in Israel and encourages terrorism in Europe as well. The reason I say that is because the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, they don't want a two-state solution. They're not interested in a two-state solution. Pretending they do, for us to pretend they do in the face of the massive anti-Jew, anti-Israel hate campaign that goes on, funded by the Palestinian Authority on television, school books, in lectures, in every kind of medium you can imagine, that doesn't indicate, you don't breed your children generation after generation after generation to hate the very people that you're on the other hand pretending, let's say to the President of the United States, that you want a two-state solution. They don't want a two-state solution. Every single one of their actions points towards the fact that they want one thing, which is the annihilation of the Jewish state. And if we pretend that they don't want that and we continue to fund their hate campaign, which we do through our taxes, and we continue to fund their terrorist campaign and encourage and incite terrorism by paying salaries to people who get put in prison for terrorist offenses, that encourages it. And it not only encourages terrorism in Israel, but it also encourages terrorism here, because many people have the propaganda and the indoctrination that they must rise and strike in support of the actions against the Zionist entity, which of course controls the world, including the media and the financial markets. So I think it's a really serious issue that we, as he says, if you believe that if you believe the narrative that really you expressed, I think you're watching the wrong movie and you should inform yourselves.
Yes, watching the right movie is what I hope we've been doing over the last 2 hours. I'd like to wrap it up with a tweet that I tweeted after the Brussels attacks. We have to become more Israeli in 3 respects. Get used to a certain threat level, hit back hard, and not forget to live and have fun. And I'd like to leave it at this. Thank you for participating. Thanks to the speakers. And we'll have now a little reception downstairs on the ground floor. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.